Can we talk a little bit about how you all joined the police service and how that has formed the community in Racine as a whole?
Well, you know, I was working at Massey Ferguson at the time, and I had wanted to be a police officer. I thought about it. I had seen my mentor, John Dice, who was, to me, one of the coolest guys that walked the earth at the time. And he was an investigator, and I used to talk to him all the time about my desire of being a police officer. So, but I was working at Massey, and I just happened to be working with a guy. His name was Jim Bertman. His dad was the sheriff at the time of Racine County. And one day he said, Larry, he said, we became friends, and he said, I'm going to go down and apply for the police department. He said, you ought to come too. I said, yeah, okay. And I went down, applied, and went through the process, and took the test, and I got the call that says, the job is yours if you want it. And the rest is history. And, you know, went to school and passed the school and became a probationary police officer.
Okay. And how common was it to have black police officers when you joined?
Oh man, I think at the time I joined, I counted before I left home. I might leave one out, no more than one, because I think it was 5 at the time. It was 5 active officers on duty at the time. And in the class that I was in, there was 5 black officers in that class also. And we all passed the class, but one was dismissed during the probationary period for reasons which to this day I don't understand, but you know, but it was 5 when I started.
Okay. Definitely.
In 72, I'm sorry.
72. Okay.
And from my experience, I was hired in 1984, so a lot of firsts had already happened by the time I showed up. Sandy Mott was one of the first female officers, and Treva Small was one of the first black female officer. So obviously Julia Burney is well known for Cops and Kids Reading Center. Julia and I were hired in 1984. And so by the time we came along, the department was slightly more integrated, and you know, there had been a lot of progress, but there was yet a lot of progress to be made. The female locker room, I think at the time, only held like 12 lockers in it, and there were, you know, now it's over 40. We had to remodel it when I was chief. So a lot of progress over that, from 84 to 2021 when I retired.
Okay, that's pretty good.
Well, I wasn't a police officer. I was a police fire commissioner.
Mm-hmm.
And I was asked to partake in that, and I hesitated. But at the same time, I said, let me take it on, because I was concerned about minorities being part of becoming police officers. So I was on the police fire commission, I think, 4 or 5 years? So that's my involvement on the police fire commission.
Okay.
I'll add that later on, because I want to talk about some things that happened to my friend, but I'll wait on that one.
Okay. Okay. So when you guys joined with the forces, especially you, Larry, did the community have a more welcoming approach because you were not white, or was it that you were treated the same as white officers when you joined?
Well, not really. I don't think it was so much of a problem with the people in the community. I know people of color were happy to see us, because like I said, it was 5 more of us, and they were happy to see us, but I think it was more of an inside job. In other words, some of the existing officers that were there wasn't happy to see us. I think we got more pushback from them than we did the people on the street. However, there were times that when we were responding to a call, there were people that were saying that, they didn't want a black officer to respond to the call, they wanted a white officer. And so we put up with a little of that, but I think the biggest disappointment or the biggest hurt to me was the internal pushback from the officers who didn't want to ride with you. And if they were your field training officers, they had to be because it was more of them than us. So they were the one that was breaking you in. And then you had to worry about what their evaluation of you was going to be because they determined whether or not you kept your job or not. So it was some worrisome time during the beginning. But I think it's kind of like it's not a rule that's printed nowhere, but once you make probation, you almost have to do something. Really.
What does that mean?
Once you pass the probationary period, let me say this. We started out at a year probation. Everybody made a year, but for some reason, the Police and Fire Commission extended it for another 6 months. So we were on probation for 18 months. And then that's when the one guy was terminated, doing that extra 6 months of probation that they said he was busy doing other things. I think the Seal Harris thing was going on at the time, and they were busy doing that, and they didn't have time to really evaluate us. So, we had to do an extra 6 months, and so that kept you on the edge, wondering whether or not. And I had just gave up one of the best jobs I had at Massey Ferguson, so saying like, wow, man, I done gave you a 2-time loser. Instead of being a police, I probably would have been a customer of police. It was nerve-wracking. It was kind of stuff maybe you don't understand or wouldn't understand because maybe you never experienced that kind of situation. But it was tight, man. It was really, you lost sleep at night, wondering whether or not you were going to get a fair assessment from the field training officer in order that you wouldn't be let go.
Mm-hmm. And did you see that improve over time during your tenure?
Well, like I said, after my probationary period, I've seen a lot of things improve. All right, you would know what I'm saying.
Yeah, so I just want to clarify a point. So what Sergeant is saying is, while you're on probation, so I was a chief, if you could release, the police chief does not have the authority to fire an officer. That goes through the Police and Fire Commission. So if an officer they can be placed on administrative leave and suspended, but only the Police and Fire Commission can fire them because they have, the police officers' bill of rights and they have a lot of protections. But if you're on probation, you could sneeze and the police chief can release you. And so what he's saying is basically, the whole shoot someone on Fifth Avenue, if once you're off probation, it's a lot harder to release an officer. What he was saying is that in the 70s, they extended the probationary period, which then allowed the chief to fire someone. Technically, it can be done without cause, so you don't even have to disclose why you did it. But once you're off probation, all these other protections kick in. So.
Okay. Interesting. When you joined, how are things different compared to when Larry was starting?
Yeah, so it's interesting to listen to stories, from Chuck and Larry because they fill in a lot of blanks for me. Our experience was a lot different. When we came in, myself, Jerry Freeman, Todd Dias, Treva, Gary Wellington, Larry Howell, there's a lot of guys. The organization was different, a lot more camaraderie. These guys are literally like pioneers, right? So they broke ground, right? And so because of the diplomacy that these guys basically, they laid out the format for us, to walk on later. So that would be John Dice, Larry Foster, and folks like that came before us. And so different atmosphere. I can tell you though, policing is a tight-knit group. Usually when you're in the union, when once you become a supervisor, that it's a little different, right? Because if you're supervising people of a different ethnicity, that has a whole nother layer of complications. And I might say, take ethnicity out of it. Police officers are A-type personalities. So let's say, for instance, if there's 10 officers who are eligible to be promoted to sergeant, but you only have 2 openings for sergeant, you're going to alienate 8 people.
I agree.
and so to answer your question, to recap, in the union it's a little more camaraderie, more tight knit. Once you start rising through the ranks, and that can be any chief. It doesn't matter what the ethnicity is. When you have to make decisions and choose who's going to be promoted and things of this nature, it can get pretty contentious after that. But in terms of the atmosphere, when I was hired, nowhere near what these officers experienced in the 70s. Complete, like night and day.
I could say when I was hired basically as a beat officer because we were hired under the Emergency Employment Act program, and we were hired to walk beats. And we had some beats. To this day, I'm wondering why we were walking them. It seemed like it was more like punishment or something to, like, for instance, I'm walking State Street, 3rd shift, 3rd Street beat. State Street, I'm sorry, and there's nothing over there. And it's like 23 below zero, and you're out walking. But some of the same fellows that you were hired with, but they were of different ethnicity, they was riding cars with their field training officer, but we were walking the beat. So we just assumed that it was a ploy to kind of make us mad or give us a hard time, and we would say, I quit. I honestly felt that way. And I honestly thought about it. I honestly thought about quitting. But a good beat man never get wet, cold, or hungry. That's what I was told. And I ran into some people on the beat that were sympathetic to what I was going through, and they took care of me. And they talked to me. An older gentleman, to this day, you all know Duck from the pool room. Duck, man, he was, hey, I'm telling you, he talked to me and he's, Larry, don't do it. Stay. It's going to get better. It's going to get better. And I'm saying, like, when? And it did. And it did. And I'm glad I stayed, but I think the attempt at that time was to say, well, we hired him, but couldn't handle it, he quit. And I was about to fall into that category, but by the grace of God and people encouraging me and keep me going, I was able to make it.
Was it common for officers to quit during that probation period because of how difficult it was?
I don't know of any that quit because of treatment of that nature, but I know that there was 5 officers at the end of our probationary period that didn't make the probation. Okay, they didn't make the probation to be police officers, so they was terminated. Along with that group was Irish Strong. However, like I said, it was 5 of them. 4 was white officers. All 4 of those officers were hired by the Racine County Sheriff Department, but they didn't hire Irish Strong. And again, like Art was saying, they don't have to give you reasons why. And to this day, Ira has since passed away. He's one of my best friends, and he's since passed away. And He never knew. He was never given a reason why. They just said, you didn't make your probationary period. But again, like I said, all other four was hired on the sheriff department, but the sheriff department wouldn't hire him.
Okay. And I think that also emphasizes how important community is when you're going through that really, really difficult time, whether it's an internal position with work or any other difficulty that you're experiencing. It's important to have the people who come up to you and go, it's going to get better, and you're doing a good job, and you should be here. And then even if you don't make it with that job, if you're let go or you quit, you still have someone to pick you up and direct you elsewhere.
You know, I could say that the community, as a whole, I think the community was behind, and they were kind of glad to see some different faces. It wasn't the total community, it was just certain segments of the community that, just like anything else, it's not 100% of this or that. There's certain people in the community that have problems, have issues with people of color. And then again, I gotta honestly say there was a few people that looked like me that had problems with me being a police officer because they say that I had sold out, you know. So it was a little of both, you know.
Yeah, when Larry is speaking about things getting better, I'll share an observation that I made, and people can look this up online and see for themselves. So, as Larry explained, they went through some challenging times in the 60s and 70s. But I was recently, we lost a civil rights leader, Jesse Jackson, recently, and so there's been a lot of clips online where you see Reverend Jesse Jackson crying, literally crying at Barack Obama's swearing in, because obviously Jesse ran in '84, and later again they changed the whole delegate structure so that it could be proportional, so that it's not a winner take all, and it really changed the balance of how politics are done today. And so I'm watching that clip where Reverend Jackson is literally in tears as watching Barack be elevated. Well, I had the exact same experience. I remember this like it was yesterday. My mother was at the swearing in, and half of Racine is at the swearing in. They had to move it from the police department auditorium to City Hall, and even the council chambers was overflowing with people involved. Every ethnicity. It wasn't a black thing, it was a community thing. But in that group was John Dias, right, who intellectually, could have been the first black chief. In that group was Sergeant Foster, who intellectually could have been the first black chief, but not for the season that they held those roles. These guys are sitting there and they're crying like babies because they stayed on the beat.
Yeah.
That's why it was important for them to be here.
Absolutely. Chuck, during your time, did you experience similar things as well, or was your position a little bit not easier, but you didn't have? Did you have the same tensions?
Yes, whenever you involved in politics, you're going to always have your enemies, ups and downs. But spiritually, I was able to discern my way through it. I had most of my concerns in the city of Racine because we could not get a place to stay. And there were times a good friend of mine by the name of Jan DeMarco and her husband would have to go around with us to try and get a place to stay. And so we dealt with a lot of discrimination and segregation, more so than the city itself. But on the job, I was able to live as live young people. Yes.
Okay. We mentioned a couple of names of significant police officers. Can we talk a little bit about them as well? I think Sylvester was one of them.
Yes.
Yeah, these two gentlemen were personal friends with Sylvester. I never had a chance to meet him, but I've read a lot online, so I have to defer to Sergeant Foster first, and they had an awesome relationship.
Lieutenant Harris and I were very good friends. As a matter of fact, he was the one that chose me to be in community relations. And he got some heat from that because that job, like Art said, was supposed to be somebody else's job. But I got it, and then all of a sudden I was being accused of taking this guy's job, But the supervisor chose me to be in there, and at that time, community relations consisted of the investigators that we went out and investigated complaints in the community, the officer friendly program, which was second to none. I think we were the first police department, I know in the Midwest, that had an officer friendly program that was sponsored by Sears at that time. And then the crime prevention unit, and I think that was Officer DeFati, Officer Meir, Officer Doc, and Officer Bob Curtis, myself, and John Lenders. We were the investigators that went out and investigated the complaints. And Lieutenant Harris was our supervisor. And at the time that I went into community relations, Lieutenant Harris was involved in what would you call that?
Scandal.
A scandal with a sitting judge here in town, and that got pretty ugly. It was pretty ugly. And it went on and on and on, and I mean, it was letters going back and forth, and eventually they had a trial in Milwaukee, and the judge ruled in favor of Lieutenant Harris, and it went to the Supreme Court, but the court refused to hear it, so it's a matter of court law now, but Seal was a very outgoing young man. He knew community relations. He knew the people. He wasn't one to take too much, browbeat from nobody. I remember one day while this case was going on, he and I was in the car, and a guy ran a stop sign. We drive an unmarked police car with a little cherry on the top. It wasn't the one with the big bright lights on it. So we were there, so had no intention of writing the guy a ticket. I don't even think he had a ticket book in the car by monsters. So we were going to go over and talk to the guy. And since I was driving, I was the jump guy. And Seal was running the license plate on the car. And I walked up to the car, and the guy says, "Are you that Lieutenant Harris?" I said, "No, sir, but he's in the car. You want to talk to him?" So he said, "Yeah, I want to have a few words with him." I said, "You sure?" So I went back to the car, and I said, "Lieutenant Harris, there's a gentleman in his car that want to talk to you." And the Seal went up to the car, and I don't know what they said, but when he come back, he told the guy to take off. We just gave him a verbal, and he left. And he never told me the conversation that they had.
Oh, man.
I imagine it was kind of spicy, but but I mean, it was just that kind of thing that was going on. It was hard to work in community relations at the time because, there was people in the police department that was siding with the judge, and there was some who wasn't, and then the guys in community relations, we were being caught up. We got caught up in that just by association. But like I said, the court ruled in his favor, and then they appealed it to the appellate court, and they upheld it, and then they appealed it to the Supreme Court, and they refused to hear the case. So at that time, Lieutenant Harris had quit the department and had moved to California, where he stayed until his passing about maybe 5 years ago. But I mean, he was well known in the city, well liked individual. He's one of my mentors. He and John Diaz. Although John and Seal might have had different ways of doing something, but it all came out the way it should, you know, but they used different methods of getting it done.
Can we talk a bit more about John Diaz as well?
Well, yeah, John was, again, I was blessed to have two great mentors. And John, like I said, John was more like Chuck, quiet individual, very strong, quiet. I mean, he kept me grounded many times, and I learned a lot from him. He was also, when Lieutenant Harris left, he was placed in charge of community relations. And he and I would attend different conferences. He wasn't a lieutenant that stayed at the desk. He would go out with us, and because the people in the community know and they respect him. I mean, all people, whether it was Latinos, white, black, everybody knew. I'm going to say it the way they said, Johnny Diaz. His name was Diaz, but you know we had to put that little Johnny Diaz, and he was. I think he was somewhat flamboyant. That's personally me, but he got the job done. You know, very likable young man. He graduated from the FBI Academy, and I think he was one of the first members of the Racine Police Department to ever do that.
That's very impressive.
Graduate from the the FBI Academy. So he was an intellectual also.
Yeah, there were only two people of color that went to the FBI Academy, myself and John Dice was the first. And so as you were sharing, Sergeant Foster, it's like, I'm just thinking like representation matters, because when you came on in the 70s, we didn't have an Inspector Dias at that time. But by the time I came on, like, this guy is still like 6'3", you know, handsome guy, very well spoken, super like whip smart. So like by the time I came on, like that, those are the people that I, you know, Sergeant Foster was still there, Inspector Dias, and so what I saw in terms of what's possible was a lot different than what they saw.
Yeah, if I might say, I remember one time that I don't know if he was a lieutenant or a captain or an inspector then, but John Dias, he was telling me that he was told when he was in high school that he shouldn't even try to go to college, that he should get a job at some factory because he never would amount to anything. I mean, and that hurt me. I mean, someone that would stifle your, you know, to say those kind of things that might, you know, to some people might turn them off, but that compelled him, that made him, hey, he was determined, and he said tonight, if you remember, at his retirement, he said, this is for Mrs., I can't remember the teacher's name now, but he had remembered that, who said I would never amount to anything, and he was retiring as a inspector of police, and he was chief of police for one day. So if you want to say that, he had to be, for the one guy that quit to come back, that had to be a day difference. He had to be separated from the police department for at least one day. And that day, John Dias was the chief of police. So I don't know if that would count, but I remember him saying that just as clearly. He was just saying like, hey, you can't pigeonhole me, you can't give me this glass ceiling, that hey, and he had remembered that because Johnny was like 60, he had been in his late 50s, early 60s when he retired, right?
Yeah.
So he remembered that all these years, and he was saying like, I showed you better than you thought I was, and that made me happy. That motivated me also.